Politics. Who gets what, when, how, and where? We already spoke about politics being who gets what, when, and how. We talked about it being a process of determining how power and resources are distributed into society without recourse to violence. And we spoke about power being the ability to get others to do what you want. We talked about politics arranging our lives into some sort of social order. And we talked about power being managed in order to create a legitimate system. And if it's not managed, then there will be violence. We talked about a government being a system or organization for exercising authority over a body of people. And we talked about authority being when power is recognized by the people as legitimate. So let's see how this all works together. The first three blue boxes, we have politics being the process or activity through which power and resources are gained or lost. This answers the question of politics of what? Power and resources are the what in what, when, how, when. In this case, we have, for example, presidential powers, money for schools, and land. We're also going to add to this when and who to start a discussion of the who, what, when, where, and how. So let's take a look at this. The process or activity, for example, would be voting for president. It's a political process. What happens when vote for president? There is power or resource which is gained or lost. In this instance, the power or resource which is gained or lost would be presidential powers, which are awarded to whoever wins the presidency. In this case, the power was gained by President Obama. When you look under who, you can see his name there as the person who won the election in the past presidential race. When does this happen? Well, we vote for president every 4 years. Similarly, let's look at the process or activity of creating a federal budget. When the federal budget is created, power and resources are distributed. In this case, the power or resource that's distributed is money. And depending on who you are, it is either gained or lost. In this instance, we're saying the power or resource was lost by who? The schools. Yearly, when the federal budget is created, there's money which is distributed, and in this case, schools were not getting a lot of money from their budget, and so therefore we can say that they lost a power or a resource. Building an interstate highway is also a political process. In this case, the power or resource which is being used is land. It's the land which is going to be that interstate highway. Who gains? Well, in this case, the driver would gain when you're building an interstate highway because they have more space to travel and different routes to get them places faster. And when would this happen? Well, it would happen whenever it's planned. In this case, you don't necessarily have something which happens at an interval. Power doesn't have to be distributed. People don't have to gain or lose power and resources on a given schedule. It can happen at any time. And sometimes, like when you're building an interstate highway and land is being taken located elsewhere, it can happen upon a building schedule which really doesn't have to do with certain intervals of time that have passed. An important thing to remember here is that for every gain there's a loss. And similarly, for every loss there's going to be a gain. So for every time Obama gained the presidential powers that he won in an election, somebody else lost them, whoever was running against him. So you could really remake this entire matrix with flip the gain to lose and then put in another who there. So you could say voting for president, power or resource would be the presidential powers, gained or lost, and you put lost. When? Every 4 years, and then in this case, who would be Obama's opponent. Same thing with creating a federal budget. If someone's losing money, like the schools, someone else is gaining it. Remember we talked about resources as being not infinite, and that you have to have a political process in the first place. There's got to be a way to share and distribute these resources because, frankly, there's just not enough for everybody to go around. If we had enough for everybody to go around, then we wouldn't need these types of processes. And so when you see something like schools losing money, then something else is gaining money. You'd have to look at the federal budget to figure out exactly who's gaining money. But whoever's allocated money in that instance, you could put them in this matrix as well. Under creating a federal budget, power or resource would be money again, and it would be gained yearly by somebody. There would be a who's the recipient of that money. Same thing with building an interstate highway. If land is gained by drivers when an interstate highway is planned, then land is lost by somebody else. Possibly whoever owned that land, who had to sell it to the government in order to create that highway. Perhaps nature conservationists would say that the free land or the trees and the nature spaces that were there are lost. And so there's always a resource which is allocated in a certain way that's creating different winners or losers. And we're going to be talking a lot about winners and losers in the next couple of slides. Here's a cartoon which illustrates this point. A politician walks up to a pair of gentlemen. He says, "I'd like your vote." And one of the gentlemen says, "What do you have for?" And the politician points to the second gentleman and says, "The power to take his money and give it to you." And the first gentleman thinks, "Sold." In this case, we have an allocation of power and allocation of resources. And someone who has the ability to actually manipulate those resources and move them from one place to another. And you can easily see in here what the difference between the gain and the loss are. The taller gentleman is going to be losing money, and the first shorter gentleman is going to be gaining the money. And whereas before it looked like they were both kind of relatively happy or unsuspecting, in the last frame, clearly the second gentleman is not happy about the decision that he is going to lose some money. It wasn't something that was expected. It wasn't something which he probably wanted to hear, but this is the way the power operates. Let's talk about the politics of how. Who, what, where, when, and how. How is rules. How do we get the things that we want? How do we get this power, these resources that we want? Well, we do it according to the rules. Rules determine how resources are allocated and how collective action takes place. They're also a framework for solving problems. You can apply this to the political world and to any other part of the world that you study, anywhere where you have some sort of political process going on. And they also influence who gets what. This is very important because if you change the rules, the winners end up changing. Let's take the game of basketball. The game of basketball is designed to have a system where the rules allow for a net, which is a certain amount of feet off the ground, a court, which is a certain length, and other facets of the game of itself, which create for certain ideal players. They may be tall, have certain muscular structures, and be able to dunk the ball in a basket which is very high off the ground. At least it is for me. If you were to change the rules, however, would the winners of basketball change? Would the people who are getting these million-dollar contracts actually change the population where they're taken from? Let's take the basket, for example, and let's lower the basket instead to 5 feet off the ground. Let's take the court and maybe shrink it in half. All of a sudden, looking for somebody who's tall, who's able to dunk a ball, it's way above their head, might not be the exact athlete that you're looking for. And those type of athletes would not be the same ones who would win the million-dollar contracts. Instead, perhaps the athlete who they'd be looking for would be a much shorter individual who can move much more quickly and act at that particular height range. I always like to think you'd have a whole lot more Filipino basketball players who, for pound, are quite good basketball players. I'd like to watch them when I'm in the Philippines. But the idea is, would you have recruiting from a whole different area, from a whole different pool of people? Would the winners of these contracts change if you change the rules? Absolutely. Because the rules are set in a certain way in order to maximize the winnings of a certain group of people. You change the rules, the winners are going to change along with them. Let's do a little exercise about this. Changing the rules and changing political winners. So let's change the required age to be president. Currently it's 35. Let's make it 18. And let's change the voting age, which is currently at 18. Let's back down to about 12. The question here is who would win? Who's going to take the presidency? Who's going to become the presidential candidate? Whereas before you needed people to be a certain age in order to do these things, perhaps people of that age had greater influence. If we want to bring it down, what's going to happen? Well, most likely my guess would be you'd have One Direction and the Nickelodeon crowd as the president and cabinet who are going into power, because you've changed the rules of who can run, you've changed the rules of who can vote, and so you've all of a sudden opened up a brand new environment for a brand new set of people to enter into the political arena, and they are going to be influenced by the sources which currently are of interest and importance to them. Let's talk about the politics of where. Where is institutions? Institutions are organizations where government power is exercised. We're going to study a lot of institutions over the course of this class. Think about Congress, the presidency, the court, and the bureaucracy. All they are places where these different things happen, where that power, it plays itself out. So what do we need to know about rules and institutions? They're very important for determining who the winners are going to be. When the rules and institutions were created at the time of the Founding Fathers, the rules and institutions were created to create a stable and prosperous society where people like the Founding Fathers themselves were likely to be the winners. So if you're wondering why you're not winning, stay tuned because we'll talk about that a lot. Perhaps you don't have much in common with the Founding Fathers themselves, and you're not really fitting into that bracket of people who are a part of the circle who are actually predetermined to win. So let's just sum up our political cycle. We already talked at length about politics being the political process which gives power to a government, and how when that power is given legitimately, then you have governmental authority. And then today we talked about the government exercising that particular power where? In institutions like the Congress and the presidency. And how is that power exercised? It's exercised through rulemaking and rule following, creating the rules for how the government is going to continue to operate. And it's those institutions and those rules which then cycle back and inform the political process and change the way that the political process works. And through that, we have a complete political cycle. Keep this in mind as we study the rest of the different institutions and rules that we'll look at in this class about how this cycle operates and what might change other parts in the future if something is altered along the way.